Hello and welcome to Telegraph Studios. Today we're discussing the changes in the UK pension law and how that affects people living abroad. And joining us is Mark Kiernan, who is from Bowl & Co and an expert in this matter. So good morning.
Good morning.
We hear there's been a lot of changes in the UK pension law, but what we haven't heard is how that affects expatriates, or expats as they're known.
So first thing is, it's not just British expatriates that this might affect. It also affects people who have lived and worked in the UK and returned to their home countries from where they may have come from previously. And in terms of planning for this eventuality, it's important that you start to plan early. If you don't plan early, then we're looking at potential tax disaster ultimately.
What about some of the other specific issues that affect them?
Let's take an example. A couple of years ago, we had a client called Jonathan approach us. He was a Hong Kong resident, aged 45 at the time, and a pension pot in the UK of around £500,000. His criteria was to look to minimise his taxes going forward, and from that perspective, he was looking at income tax, death planning taxes, and the size of his pot going forward and the lifetime allowance in the UK.
So let's take them one by one. First of all, income tax.
So from an income tax perspective, in Jonathan's case, for example, if he remained in a UK pension scheme, because Hong Kong doesn't tax overseas pension income, he would be subject to UK income tax at source, potentially up to 45%, whereas by transferring that scheme to an alternative jurisdiction, he could reduce that tax charge.
And taxation on death?
And tax on death, if he remained in a UK scheme, then he would be subject to tax on death on a lump sum distribution of 45% if he died after the age of 75.
And finally, the pension pot.
So from the pension pot perspective, our key concern there is the lifetime allowance. In the UK, that has been reducing both in real and actual terms now, and so we need to really consider how we best plan for that. Obviously, Jonathan had 20 years to retirement. His pension fund was worth around £500,000. So from that perspective, if Jonathan did the transfer now to an overseas pension scheme, he would benefit by the test against the lifetime allowance being done now, and therefore any tax charges which may be associated at longer term would be significantly reduced, if not eliminated totally.
One of the most commonly discussed topics regarding pensions is freedom and choice that we're given, so we have more control over our pensions. Is that freedom of choice still available to people who move their pensions abroad?
Well, it's interesting the UK has really gone first on this, and I think we know it's very much a watching brief from the rest of the world to see whether they follow suit as well. In an example of Jonathan, he's just got to keep a watching brief to see whether changes in his jurisdiction apply, so he can also do the same flexible access as they could for UK schemes.
So coming to Jonathan, if he does make this move and takes his money abroad, how does he actually go about that? Is there like a mechanism to be able to do it?
The UK government introduced what we call QROPs, which is Qualifying Recognised Overseas Pension Schemes. And through that mechanism, effectively, an individual who lived overseas could transfer their UK benefits to another jurisdiction without tax consequence at the time of transfer.
Tell me a little bit more about QROPs, and also how does somebody go about finding one?
Well, I think Jonathan would need to engage with his financial advisor within his country of where he lives.
And where would he find such an advisor who would know about QROPs?
Well, the easiest place to look for those types of advisors is the internet, to do some Google searching to have a look, and then obviously to do some investigation on the advisor you're going to use, make sure they're a professional firm, preferably regulated, and have the relevant qualifications to give that kind of advice. So the advisor would look at Jonathan, look at his financial situation, not just at his pension, but also the other aspects of his life, and ensure that in giving us advice that he considers all the aspects of that to ensure that a QROPS is relevant and appropriate for what Jonathan would need long term effectively.
When is the sort of time that you should be looking at these kind of questions to ask?
So I think with anything in terms of pensions, it's always good to start to plan early. You could start planning before you left the UK if you knew you were leaving, or you can plan as soon as you've left the UK, but certainly you need to start to plan for these things as soon as possible.
Now, in our conversation, you've mentioned Isle of Man, you've mentioned Hong Kong, Gibraltar. Where do you get the most interest in QROPs from?
So most of our business comes from the Far East, Middle East and Europe. I think we've members in probably 60 countries around the world, so it's a global business. The single biggest sort of jurisdiction, I think, would be Australia. That's where most British people expatriate to.
Well, you've given a lot of food for thought there for expats to think about. Mark Kiernan, thank you very much indeed.